Hi.
So there you
Okay, what do we do?
go.
Oh, bless you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear
Okay,
you.
great.
I can hear somebody.
Sorry, my mic doesn't work on my computer. So I'm going to, is Lee here anyway? Is Lee online? We were having some technical difficulties with our accounts. So I need to make sure we have Lee. Let me get her the link to get in, make sure she's in here. How's everyone?
Great. Fine, thank you.
Awesome.
Hey, Teresa, Joe's here.
I see you, Joe. It looks like we have a lot of people on here, so we have a lot of people interested in scheduling. That's awesome.
Hello.
Is Lee in here now? I don't see her anywhere.
I can.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Who is that?
Darlene.
There's Lee. Okay. All right. This is our first time doing a conference call like this for members, so it's a little different than our webinar. So sorry about us taking a few minutes to get everything set up, but it's good to be with you all today. I'm Teresa, the Director of Membership. If you haven't met me yet, you get emails from me and notifications from me. So glad that you're all here, and I hope you have lots of questions. So hand it off to Lee.
Good afternoon. My name is Lee Dixon. I am the Executive Director of Godly Play Foundation. I've met several of you because I see lots of familiar faces on the phone or on the screen. And today's session is about scheduling your stories for a school year or for a Godly Play year. There will be some materials put up on the members' portal when we wrap this session up. Hopefully some of the questions, I'll make some adjustments to the materials as we are looking to meet needs of what you're seeing out there for scheduling. I thought what I'd do is do just a quick overview of our recommended approach to scheduling stories for a school year, and then open it up to questions, since one of the challenges we have is that many of the people, or we're often asked why there isn't a standard schedule on the Godly Play Foundation website or part of core training. And the reality is that it's not that simple. Each of you have a different program than the other. Each of you have a different type of schedule of when you're in a Godly Play room and maybe when you're not. You have the situation of one group that might have only one classroom and it's multi-age versus another church which might have multiple classrooms and able to really have a younger, middle, and older childhood program, allowing them to tailor their schedule to be able to meet the needs of those different age groups. So given that there's so many variables out there, we, especially in the case of the number of years you've used Godly Play, the number of classrooms you have, your calendar, it's not practical to put out a standard schedule. That plus we have 90 stories in the total curriculum. And of those 90 stories, many of them are core, enrichment, and extension. Some of them apply to you if you have the older classrooms, some of them don't. So it's a fairly variable approach. And yet it can be a lot of fun to schedule stories. I'm now in my 18th year of scheduling for the St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Cohasset, Massachusetts. We're blessed with 3 classrooms and having done Godly Play for 20 years. So our situation may be similar to yours and it may be very different. Our spiral curriculum really focuses on the learning reality of us, the philosophy of Maria Montessori, that it takes 3 encounters with a lesson for children to be able to put it into context and truly understand it. That's not unlike our liturgical calendar of readings in the big church, as we call it. But it does allow for a guidance in setting a schedule, in being able to pay attention to making sure those core stories have an opportunity to be heard 3 times. That may not be 3 times in 3 consecutive years. It may be 3 times over a 6-year period, but it's a guidance there. So practical, this is intended to be as practical as possible. There are 4 variables that you should consider when you're starting to establish a schedule. The first is the age makeup of your Godly Play rooms. Do you have 1 room? Do you have multiple rooms? And what are the ages in there? Your church's Godly Play session schedule. There are many churches out there for which Godly Play is held perhaps all 4 weeks in a month. But in some cases, there's family services, so Godly Play is only in session 3 or other reasons. So you need to know what your schedule is and establish a calendar accordingly. You need to know what story materials are available to you. If you have 1 classroom, what stories are in there? If you have multiple classrooms, what stories are in each classroom? What's available to be scheduled? And that may generate a wish list. You may want to purchase stories if your budget allows, or we also have some fairly successful stories out there of people holding story showers and getting additional materials for their classroom that way. But you need to know what you have available to schedule. And then you need the liturgical calendar for the year. And one of the best resources for that is a blog called Rose of Sharon. And on that, Sharon Pearson, who's in faith formation editor at Church Publishing, publishes a yearly calendar, which is my go-to place to start my scheduling, because it tells me how many Sundays are between Labor Day and Advent, for example, or how many Sundays in Lent are between Epiphany and the beginning of, which this year for 2019, by the way, is all 9 are going to be in the calendar. So having that liturgical calendar, assuming you are a liturgical church, is important because you can lay it in next to your calendar for your church. And the intent behind that to know, for example, perhaps there are 16 Sundays between Labor Day and the beginning of Advent. But for your calendar, you may only have 14 of them or 11 of them that you're actually in Godly Play. So that gives you 11 weeks to schedule that particular season for your church. So knowing those 4 things, the age makeup of your classrooms, your church's calendar, and when you're in Godly Play, stories, materials that are available, and then the liturgical calendar is kind of your 4 grounding things to have in front of you when you're starting to schedule your courses, your calendar, your story schedule. We will send you a link to Sharon Pearson's Rose of Sharon planning calendar. I find it extremely useful, and we will also send you a link of a kind of a template of a schedule that you can adjust to your own church's requirements. One other thing that's probably a good resource to have is what stories you told last year, so that you know where it's appropriate to repeat and where perhaps last year you didn't cover a core story that's important to cover this year. So that's another area to have. Another reference point for starting your scheduling is Appendix B in our complete guide to Godly Play. And we'll put a version of that up on the website, on your members portal. But that tells you which stories are core and which stories are extension and which stories are enrichment, giving you an opportunity to understand, where it's appropriate to perhaps schedule in extension stories such as Moses, and where you have your core presentation such as Exodus that goes along with that. So my vision is you have everything in front of you, that all of you do have some level of knowledge in Word or Excel, whichever tool works for you the best. So you have your calendar, you have what you told last year, you have the liturgical calendar, you have the story materials you have available, and all of that comes together into a creative process known as scheduling. Once you've created your calendar to start that scheduling, things to think about are your when you're going to kick off. A lot of you may already be in Godly Play already, but for my classroom, we're kicking off in a week. And when you're going to end. And perhaps the very first Godly Play session and the very last Godly Play session have something special that you do. And so you want to factor that in. You want to think about the stories such as baptism, Good Shepherd, and World Communion, and then the circle of the church year. Where is it appropriate for your program to tell those stories, since they're somewhat season independent? And you may also want to consider, if you have older classroom, children in an older classroom, establishing a year A and a year B kind of cadence to your scheduling. For example, in year A, you may want to tell the Faces of Easter story, and in year B, tell the Greatest Parable, if you're fortunate enough to have those materials. So there's many things, and all of this, by the way, is in a outline that you will have on your members portal. So if you're scribbling notes quickly, and I'm speaking very quickly, you'll be able to read that in the future when you get that. So scheduling, well, before we go into the next outline I had, let's open it up for questions.
I have a question.
Yes, what?
Angela Goldsmith.
Hi, Angela.
Hey, we're starting a new program at our church, and I do have this book, Young Children in Worship, and they suggest that you do 4 sessions of getting ready to be with God. Are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with the book, yes, and that concept, yes.
Do you think that's necessary for me to do?
As Jerome matured Godly Play from that original book, Young Children in Worship, where he collaborated with Sonia, and matured it into what is now today called Godly Play, he believed that modeling was much more effective than the instructional approach that's outlined in Young Children in Worship. So what he suggests in our volume 1 and in Teaching Godly Play is perhaps that very first day, that very first week, it is a little bit more instructional, where you remind children what it's like to be getting ready, what it is, what we're going to do next. We're going to have a feast, or we're going to hear a story, or we're going to wonder about it. You do a little bit more instructional work there, and then perhaps for the youngest children, you might need to do a little bit more of that in the second week. But very quickly, the modeling and the standard approach to a Godly Play session tells that story without having to do those 4 sessions that were in that original book.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions?
I do. Caroline.
Hi, Caroline.
I've done course stories, and we have some kids that are now ready to do extension and enrichment stories pretty much for the first time. So I'm pretty familiar with scheduling core, but not with extension and enrichment. And so my question is, particularly we were kind of looking at our fall and our winter quarters. How often do you go back and really spend some time telling a full course story? And how often do you dive off into an enrichment one? Because there's so many opportunities in the fall for that.
Yes, there are, because there's so many wonderful enrichment stories, especially about the people of God. So the answer to that is again, it depends, and I'm sorry, I'm going to say that a lot. If you have very young children in your class along with the older children, I would recommend you always do the full core story. If you have a group of children that have already heard Exodus and 10 Best Ways 2 or 3 times, then you may just bring that story out and very quickly remind them so that it anchors it, and then bring out, in that same Sunday, then bring out the Moses story, for example, and spend the time and wonder about that one. So you always try and anchor to that core story that the extension deepens.
And so do you always anchor it by actually getting down the core story and placing it in the circle and then going back and getting the second?
I've done that. I've also then, again, it depends on your circle, because we all kind of deal with or work with circles that you may have children that have been there for 3 years, and you may have children that have just walked in the door because their parents heard about this thing called Godly Play. So if you have a mix of new children, I recommend you bring out the old story and the core story, and you actually have it in front of you, the materials. If you have a group of children that you've seen for those 3 years and there aren't any new members of your circle, then you could just point to it and talk about it, and then bring out the one that you have.
Thank you. That's
It's
helpful.
meeting. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So we are just this year split. We've had a multi-age classroom, and we're splitting into 2 classrooms this year. And so I'm struggling with. Do you have an opinion about the value of having both classes doing the same core stories at the same time, or if the schedules are varied?
Very, very good question. Thank you. That's actually something I hadn't put in my notes. So let me make a quick note to add some comments on that. There are times where it makes very good sense to have the same story being told in all 3 classes. Typically, that might be day 1. So that the siblings go home all talking about the same story, if you happen to have siblings across the groups. The Holy Bible story being a new story that came out in the revised second volume 2 of the Complete Guide. That one is one that we recommend get told either on day 1 or day 2, because it does anchor the room and the year to this wonderful book called the Bible. But you can diverge if it makes sense, especially if as you're opening up a second classroom, which is great and exciting. Those children are ready to hear stories that are probably more enriching and extending. So at some point you would diverge. Other places where it makes sense to, align the story schedules across the 2 rooms could be obviously like Pentecost or the first Sunday in Lent, or wherever it makes sense to align them back together again so that everyone talks the same or has that same experience at those transitional points. One year, what we did in one of my classroom or my context was we told creation, the flood, great family, and then the older classroom heard at Abraham and Sarah, while the younger classroom sort of kept on going, journeying through the desert with the people of God, those people of God in the more core area. And then we came back together again for the Exile and Return.
Okay. Okay, good.
If you use the parent pages, you're welcome. If you use the parent pages, they're available digitally now, and you can buy one set for your church and then make as many copies as you want. But if you use the parent pages, right now we only have the parent pages for the first 3 volumes. So as you go into, anything in volumes 6, 7, and 8, those aren't available yet. But the extension and enrichment stories are available that come out of volumes 2, 3, and 4. So you have the opportunity to be able to give to a parent both the core story that perhaps their younger child heard and the enrichment story that their older child heard.
Okay. Perfect.
I have a question.
Questions?
It's Kim.
Sure.
So I always feel this great rush somehow, and I'm not sure it's important or not, to get through, when I'm doing the core stories with the classroom, to get through all the way through to the Exile and Return before Advent. How important is that? Because I know, and then in the winter, we start with the parables typically with a younger class. My son's completion.
The reality is none of us have enough time and enough Sundays to do all the stories. So it's a choice. No, you don't have to get all the way to Exile and Return every year. But at least once within that 3-year period that, if you have the ideal classroom of here's a group of 3 to 6-year-olds, they should hear Exile and Return at least once before they move into the next class, where they should hear Exile and Return at least once. So it's a pattern type of challenge. Ark in the Temple. Do you need to tell both of those each year? Maybe one year and one the other year to be able to again meet our challenging number of Sundays versus number of stories. But I also feel that same kind of urgency. How do I get all the way through the entire Old Testament before Advent hits? Yes, Angela?
Can you tell me about the parent pages?
Yes, they're companion pages, 2 pages per story, 2 physical sheets per story. You can print it back, front and back. That are you can purchase them through church publishing. They're digital downloads. You buy one for your church. And I actually don't remember how much they cost, so I do apologize for that. But that would allow you to have a handout, and you can also send them electronically to your parents, so that the parents know what you told in the classroom and what the wondering about it is. The intent behind those parent pages is to encourage the family to continue talking about that story throughout the week.
Okay, that's something new for me. I didn't know that was available. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. We find that they are an underutilized resource, and we're sort of seeking places in which we possibly can promote that or educate people a little bit more about them, because they are, I think, valuable. We use them have used them in my church. We didn't last year, I will admit. And we're bringing them back this year because we had parents who simply said they miss being able to know what their children heard. They liked to be able to wonder about the stories with them. They also like the opportunity to go read the Bible and learn about those stories, because we have a lot of parents who are themselves or have very little church background. So seeing we're educating on both levels, the children and the parents.
I love the idea of being able to send those digitally.
Yeah.
Yes, they're part of why we discontinued actually the paper practice. They were originally sold in paper format, and we found that that didn't meet the needs of our programs out there. One, it was expensive to have to buy so many copies, and two, it's a little more cumbersome than being able to perhaps send things electronically.
Yeah.
Along those same lines, I'm curious to hear what types of parent outreach people do.
I can offer what my church does, which is that at the beginning of the school year, or beginning of our program year, which does correspond with our public school system, that very first Godly Play morning, we have a parent orientation. We have childcare during that, and we do an overview for the parents of the of what a Godly Play session looks like or is, and all of its different pieces. And we then bring the parents to their children's classroom so that we can orient them to the actual environment and answer any questions. We found that since it's on Sunday when they have to be there to have their children there, that we get a lot of good participation in that approach. We then, that first month, so in the month of September, we will have an evening adult Godly Play story, usually using an Old Testament desert story, so that the parents that choose to come have an orientation into what their children are doing, including a full session which involves work and feast and things of that nature. We'll have periodic other things during the year, but that's what we use to kick off the year. What do other people do?
We typically do a session for parents at the beginning of the year, somewhat similar, not necessarily the first week, but during a Sunday school hour. Just primarily, it's just a full session of Godly Play, and then some time to talk about it. And then we have multiple other opportunities. Done 6-week series of Godly Play for adults. I've done the stories at our mom's group, at a session meeting, on a retreat. So people in our congregation have many opportunities, I think, as adults to experience it.
That's so cool.
We do something at Advent. We do a family potluck, and I've shared gathered everyone in a huge circle and shared the Advent story. And then the work time has been creating crush figures for families to take home. So
This year, with the publication of the Stories of God at Home that Jerome published last spring, there is a at-home script for the Christmas story or the Advent story. And also Godly Play Resources has several levels of do-it-yourself, including coloring pages as well as cardboard versions. So it makes it a little bit more affordable if you're doing an adult forum for those programs. But that what you described, Kim, was something that is probably quite enriching for the families.
Yeah, Cheryl Miner mentioned that to me, and I think, oh, great, we'll add that this year. We'll get the do-it-yourself kits.
Yeah, if anyone on the phone is planning on doing an adult forum around the Stories of God at Home programs, we are going to have an email come out soon to the general group, but to members first, and basically let you know if you're planning on that. We have some resources to support you in that. There's a video demonstration of the Advent or the Christmas story. I am the storyteller in that video, so I apologize in advance for because it's very strange to be videoed and for that type of a setting. But they're very useful in helping parents perhaps defray some fears that a parent might have at being able to do, or a grandparent at being able to do this in their own setting. So I think that the videos will be very successful as well as, or very helpful, as well as I think there are going to be, for you as church leaders, if you're doing an adult forum or someone in your churches, there's a email address to ask questions of. There will be a Facebook page and things of that nature to help support your practice in doing this. So.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Other scheduling questions?
Did Karen's question in the comments get answered about the Holy Family and the Holy Bible?
I am not seeing the comments.
In the chat box?
Sorry.
That's okay. She said, which would you recommend that go to do first, the Holy Family or Holy Bible?
I would recommend the Holy Bible, since the Holy Family is in the Holy Bible.
Are you sure the Holy Bible's not also in the Holy Family?
Oh, yes, actually, good point. Very good point. I do believe that there's some synergy there. So, however, neither is wrong. To just answer the question, neither of those order would be wrong. And several people have a tradition or practice that their very first Godly Play session, they dress the focal shelf as part of setting the circle and getting the circle ready. And if you're going to do that, then obviously the Holy Family story is appropriate for doing that very first session.
Lee, I have another question, please.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not familiar with the Holy Bible story.
It is a brand new story, or brand new for us. It came out in February with the revised edition of Volume 2.
Okay, revised Volume 2. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's Volume 2. Okay.
And the materials for that are fairly easy for most churches to pull together without having to spend any money. You just find the best Bible or the most beautiful Bible that you have in your church that you can actually put in your classroom, because the intent is this Bible stays in your classroom throughout the year. And you talk about how the stories came together and were formed into this book that we call the Bible, and then we talk about how the classroom is essentially the stories in this book and is itself a Bible. And then the practice that we recommend is that each day, each Sunday, if you're telling a story that comes out of the Bible, that you actually go and open the Bible and let the children see where you're putting a bookmark that indicates this is where the words are for this story that we're telling you today.
Okay.
And my class last year, I have a mixed class of 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And last year, that connection to the Bible became an extremely strong part of each Godly Play story we told. And the quote that I've told many people is when we got to Advent and we started telling on the first Sunday of Advent, the prophets pointed the way. They're like, well, you didn't go to the Bible and show us where that is. And I'm like, well, the season of Advent isn't in the Bible. What do you mean Advent's not in the Bible? And it generated an entire wonderful, wonderful set of wondering. So,
thank you.
Also, if you can purchase the new revised and added stories individually through Church Publishing, you can just buy the download for it. So I put the link in the chat for the Holy Bible story, but you can purchase the other individual stories on there as well.
Okay, thank you.
yes, good point. Thank you, Teresa.
Lee, could you point me to the place, and maybe it's in the Small Green Teaching Godly Playbook, I don't remember. Can you point me to the place where there's some more conversation about students needing to encounter the story 3 times and kind of the theory behind that from Montessori background? We had a conversation with our Sunday school teachers this week when we were calendaring extension and enrichment, and they're so excited to do something new, but I don't want them to discount the wonderful qualities of them encountering the same stories again and again.
Oh, excellent point, Carolyn. Excellent. I will include in the things that we upload to the member portal a specific white paper on the spiral curriculum. And it's the importance of encountering the stories 3 times. And it is mentioned in Teaching Godly Play, the little green book, but this particular white paper dives into it a little bit more deeply. You also encounter that a little more if your storytellers are, or your Godly Play mentors are ready and there's an advanced training in your area. They spend quite a bit of time in an advanced training talking about the spiral curriculum and its levels and impact. So that's another area to learn more. And then to your point of your storytellers or are excited about learning new things, that's fabulous, absolutely fabulous. Because some of our stories, we find that some storytellers might be a little intimidated, although they're all written with the same sparse language and such, but some are a little longer. But one thing I caution you about in your scheduling, especially if you had Godly Play for a couple of years, is adding an enrichment or a different story, a non-core story, to a younger classroom because the teacher's bored. The intent behind the schedule really is to meet the needs of the children. And if your storyteller has told the flood 3 times or 2 times and is bored about telling it or expressing boredom about telling it again, there are many other ways to channel that interest in learning new stories. The adult forums that we were talking about earlier, or perhaps telling a story at a confirmation class, or splitting your classroom into or creating a second classroom. There are ways to channel that interest that your volunteers have in learning new, but not present stories to younger children that they're perhaps not ready for.
Their interest was that we had when you tell a story for the first time, the children are just absolutely silent. And then it's learning how to do a different kind of a circle when the children have mastered this story and are beginning to share. And a couple of our storytellers are having trouble, appreciating both.
Very good point. Yeah, the wondering matures as the children mature. And so sometimes that can challenge you as the mentor in the circle. And perhaps another webinar idea for members is to ask Cheryl Miner or someone, Rosemary Beals, to come and talk about wondering with older children. They've thought about that and done some more writing about that to help with that kind of maturation of your storyteller into that level of wondering. Wondering, you don't have to have all the answers. I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to add that I believe it's the work of the children also to test the boundaries. And once they've heard a story the first time, sometimes they will come in a lot quieter, but it's also an opportunity to learn how to be together in that circle. So to kind of enjoy all of that. So as a storyteller, I think the storytellers are becoming fluent over the year, year by year as well as the children.
And constantly reminding ourselves we don't have to have the answers.
Mm-hmm.
We can wonder too.
Hi, I have a question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Marcia. We tell Godly Play stories year-round throughout the summer, and our classroom ages are 3 to 5. And I'm wondering, given those ages, we think it's okay to tell the same stories each year because they're going to forget. They may hear them at home as well, but what do you think about that?
I think I have a level of jealousy. Is that one of those 10 you're not supposed to covet? Anyway, I'm being able to do Godly Play all year. That's a wonderful opportunity. So you have more time to touch each of those core stories. And so over a 3-year period, you would be telling all the same core stories. So repeating is, I keep using the analogy of, every 3 years we hear the same gospel, we hear the same Old Testament reading in our church. If you use the lectionary, there's nothing wrong with repeating those stories. Each time we come to them, we're different, and the child will be different, and the wondering will be different.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Hey, this is Joe Taylor, and for the person that was talking about doing Godly Play year-round, how does that work for you? Are you impeded any at all by people taking vacations, and do you find some scheduling challenges around summer vacations and that sort of thing, or do you just have a lot of teachers that you can use?
We have 4 regular teachers. And I used to be a teacher. I'm the coordinator, and we're constantly trying to get new storytellers involved. But we move forward throughout the year, and we juggle our schedules. We're a fairly small church with about 200 members, and of course, there are some Sundays where we don't have children in our children's worship class. But we have our schedule laid out, and if something comes up for one of the storytellers, then another storyteller will fill in.
Thank you for that, because I would love to be able to do that as well.
Yeah.
A couple questions in the chat box. Oh, go ahead.
I tried to find the chat box, Teresa, so I'm afraid I'm challenged.
Okay, I'll just read them to you. Andrea is asking about the Holy Bible Story and the Books of the Bible Story. Would you recommend telling the books of the Bible rather than the Holy Bible? I think the question is if they're interchangeable. She said last year their teachers told the Holy Bible story, and then they requested the materials for the books of the Bible, so they could tell that as well. So they now have books of the Bible materials. So she's wondering if she can schedule that rather than the Holy Bible, and what your opinion is on that.
I think that the Holy Bible story is more important than the books of the Bible story. It would be great to be able to do those as a side-by-side if you have a mature classroom or a mature circle, a godly play literate circle, for lack of a better phrase. Those two would come beautifully as a side-by-side. But the priority is the Bible story itself. And having the materials for books of the Bible is a beautiful thing. Those are beautiful materials, and not many classrooms have that gift. So being able to do both are great.
And then Karen is asking about the season of Lent through Pentecost, because a lot of that is the flat plaque, and how sometimes it can appear boring to some people, and how to respond for those who are wondering about more of the 3D multisensory experience that the fall lessons have, beyond just the answer of the magic of the wondering time where you bring the other materials. So what do you do in that time when the story just seems too flat in that literal sense? And to ho-hum is what the words that she used.
We hear that at times. It is very deliberate. The materials and choice of materials are very deliberate on Jerome's part. And the thought is that as we go into the stories of Jesus, that yes, he was a man that walked on the earth, but he is also a metaphor, and so the intent is those flat pieces are intended to allow for what's the phrase? More energy into entering the story, and as such, they are flat. So yes, we brings other story materials to the story for like faces and such. The other recommendation on a more practical manner is if you're telling, let's say, the greatest parable, or you're telling faces, that you interject a different story that perhaps is more three-dimensional during it. So perhaps you do synagogue in the upper room, which has the 3 dimensions to it, if you happen to have that material too. Or you do Good Shepherd and World Communion, so that there is both the use of the plaques and the honoring the plaques and the story that go along with the plaques, but then a Sunday in which you've got something that has more dimension to it, or it's a different genre. Did that answer your question, Karen? I got a thumbs up.
And along those lines, when you have a 7-part story like The Faces of Easter, how often do people compact that into fewer weeks? Like, we've sometimes done it in 3 weeks or 2 weeks and split it in half if we have to. What do you recommend?
That is common. That goes back to, you have to have your calendar next to the liturgical calendar to know what, if you're not in it's rare that we're going to be in the classroom, or it is my experience that it's rare we're in the classroom for 6 Sundays of Lent. Maybe there's something special on Palm Sunday and your church does something different. You don't have godly play, so you've got only 5. So it is common that you do double up. recommend that you don't try and do all 7 in 1 week, because that's a lot for the children to absorb. So breaking it up at least into 2 or 3 is the ideal for those longer ones. The same happens in Advent. Most part, we may not be in church all 4 Sundays of Advent, depending on your particular church's traditions. So you may need to double up in Advent, or if you happen to have, the story Mary, Mother of Jesus, or one of the other stories that you want, Glorious Impossible, that you want to interweave into that season, you may double up in Advent situation as well. So that is a fairly common practice to double them up.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Yes?
This is Carol. We've added a preschool program to our Godly Play this year. And I have the teachers scheduled to teach the Faces of Easter as independent stories to the preschoolers, without maybe retelling each one each week. Is that going to work, do you think?
I think it'll work, yes. What I would recommend that you try and do some reference back to the prior weeks. And I would also recommend that you take a pulse after each week just to see if it's working or not. And then you can adjust.
Okay. What about the final card or a plaque? Is that going to be hard for the children, the Easter story in preschool?
In preschool, no. No. Children, I mean, our whole philosophy is children have a close relationship with their God already, and we're just helping mentor it. There may be some who have questions, especially if they've recently experienced in their life a death, maybe a grandparent or a pet of some sort. But in my experience and in my church's experience and in my work with Godly Play, most people are amazed at how deep even the preschoolers understand that story.
That's helpful.
It seems to me that usually the children are actually in some ways a little bit more comfortable and almost grateful to have a space where they can name death and for that to be okay to do, because there's so many places where adults are uncomfortable. It's the adults who are uncomfortable with it. But my experience with the preschoolers, because that's the main circle that I'm in, is with our 3 and 4-year-olds. That they just go with it, and they're right there, and it's not shocking or alarming to them. It's just a safe space to name it, and they seem to do very well.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
And because that last card is, both the death and the resurrection, there's that, we're ending on the happy note of the reserrection. So, but I agree with Carolina. It's an opportunity to talk about death. I had a circle that twins were in my class, and their father had recently passed away right around the Easter time. And it was an interesting, very, very powerful class in which those children just amazed me at their maturity in talking about knowing their father in a different way. I am mindful of the time, and I know we started a few minutes late, so I'm more than willing to spend a few minutes later to answer any other questions. So I'll just spend a minute or two saying, when you're planning your story schedules for the year, I do recommend that you plan the whole year. Because in some respects that allows you to identify that perhaps you want to tell a story that you don't have on your shelf just yet. And you can either budget for or do a story shower type of thing to get the materials or make them. That you plan by season, assuming you're all liturgical season oriented. You do are mindful of the stories told last year, mindful of the goal of repeating at least 3 times, but not call it handcuffed by that. And think about those big stories and where you want I call them big stories. Sorry, stories such as baptism and such. And is there an appropriate time in your church's year, your church's practice where baptism should get fit in, since it's somewhat seasonless. And beware of this, of 2019, there are 9 Sundays between Epiphany and the beginning of Lent. So, and we only have 6 parables if you happen to be a parable church or a church that uses parables in that time frame. So you're gonna have to fill something then.
Are there certain parables that you would call core parables?
All the 6 that are, yes, there are 6 core parables. Do I have that document open? I do not. So Good Shepherd and World Communion. I'm sorry, that's not a parable. The parable of the Good Shepherd, parable of the pearl, parable of the leaven, parable of the Good Samaritan. Those 6 that, parable of the mustard seed, the other one, and parable of the sower. Those 6 are the core lessons, and they're all in volume 3 of the Complete Guide of Godly Play. There are 2 extension parables. One is the Deep Well, and the other is a Parable of Parables, but those are not core.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Parables are also, for if you don't have those in your classroom already, they're also fairly easy to make, to bring them in on a budget. I think I've hit all the highlights I know. What we'll be putting up in the member portal includes a write-up of essentially what I've covered today. We will have a link in that write-up to Sharon Pearson's planning calendar. That's as I said, wonderful resource. It not only has, the seasons and the Sundays and the readings, but also references to holidays and things of that nature. So it really kind of anchors you in what you have to schedule. I'll put up the white paper on spiral curriculum, and I'll put up an example of the document that we use at my church to schedule stories. If there's anything else that we've touched on that you don't have, please get in touch with Teresa and we'll make sure we get it up there for you as a resource.
Hey, Teresa, can you send the link to the member portal?
Yeah, that'll be included in the email. And it's online all the way under to the right of our website. There's a button that says membership, and it's under that. There's a link for it.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then the password, just a reminder, is membership circle. It's all one word, all lowercase. Membership circle.
I wanted to ask a question about the communion series, like doing the Good Shepherd World Communion, the synagogue, the Circle of Holy Communion. Is there any thoughts about when you put that in your series? Or should that be for another time?
Those are what I refer to as seasonless, so they should fit wherever you choose to put them in. It best fits your church. If your church does a lot of perhaps an outreach dinner or some sort of a community dinner, you may want to do Good Shepherd and World Communion just before that and kind of talk about bringing everybody to the table. So it that's where it's important to know what your church is doing to be able to maybe align some stories to meet that need and connect the children into that community. And I am going to thank every one of you for your time. It's been delightful seeing your faces, listening to your voices, and hopefully I've given you some guidance on the art of story scheduling. And if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to email me. I'm lee.dixon@godlyplayfoundation.org.
Thank you.
With that,
Yeah.
blessings on your day.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Leave the meeting. Leave the meeting.